The 20-year-old's body lay frozen beneath a Wisconsin bridge for 10 days before anyone found her, curled in a fetal position, completely nude and solid as ice. She had been stripped of everything: her clothes, her jewelry, even her identity. For over a year, investigators knew her only as Frigid Frida, a nameless victim whose violent death would remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. What they didn't know was that hundreds of miles away, a Kansas family was desperately searching for their missing daughter, Lisa Staes, who had vanished from Chicago's Rush Street bar scene just 11 days before the frozen body was discovered. Lisa Staes had been embracing her newfound independence in the winter of 1976, recently moved out of her parents' house, and enrolled in community college classes. Like many young adults navigating their early 20s, she was still figuring out what direction her life would take. That January, she decided to visit her cousins Michelle Wadman and Kurt Ron in the Chicago area during her college break, seeking the excitement and freedom that the city's nightlife promised. On the evening of January 13, 1976, Lisa accompanied Kurt to Mother's, a popular bar on Rush Street. The atmosphere was lively, filled with music and conversation, and Lisa quickly struck up a connection with the man she met inside. As the night progressed, she became increasingly interested in this new acquaintance and eventually approached Kurt with a proposition. She was considering leaving with the man and asked Kurt to wait approximately 30 minutes for her. If she didn't return by then, he should feel free to head home without her. Kurt honored his cousin's request and waited the designated time. When Lisa failed to reappear, he assumed she had decided to leave with her new companion and departed as instructed. This decision would later weigh heavily on him as the family realized that Lisa had vanished into the Chicago night without a trace. The following afternoon, when Lisa still hadn't returned to Michelle's residence, her cousins began to worry. They spent the day searching Rush Street establishments, hoping to find someone who had seen Lisa or could provide information about her whereabouts. Their efforts proved fruitless, as no one they encountered could offer any helpful details about what had happened to their missing cousin. As evening approached and Lisa remained missing, Michelle contacted the Oak Park Police Department just after 10 p.m. to file a missing persons report. The responding officers entered Lisa's information into the National Crime Information Center database and checked for recent accidents in the area, but their initial efforts went no further. They conducted no interviews, organized no neighborhood canvasses, initiated no ground searches, and didn't even request a photograph of the missing woman. 10 days passed without any updates or progress from law enforcement. Growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of action, Lisa's father, Jack Staes, traveled from his home in Leawood, Kansas, to Chicago, hoping that providing additional information about his daughter might spur more aggressive investigative efforts. Despite his personal involvement, the case remained stagnant, leaving the Staes family in an agonizing state of uncertainty. For over a year, the family endured the torment of not knowing what had happened to Lisa. Her younger brothers, Grant and Tim, aged 17 and 9, respectively when she disappeared, watched their parents age rapidly under the strain of constant worry. Grant later reflected that the experience fundamentally shaped his teenage years, though he didn't fully comprehend its impact at the time. The unknown nature of Lisa's fate proved more devastating than closure would have been, even if that closure brought tragic news. As months passed without answers, acquaintances began suggesting that Lisa was likely dead, comments that Grant found harsh but increasingly difficult to dismiss. The family knew Lisa wouldn't have disappeared voluntarily without contacting them, particularly Michelle, with whom she maintained a close relationship. The longer Lisa remained missing, the more obvious it became that something terrible had occurred. After approximately 1 year of frustration with Oak Park Police's inaction, Lisa's parents reached out to their local law enforcement for assistance. Even though Lisa had vanished from Illinois, the family hoped that fresh perspective from another department might generate progress. In February 1977, Captain Al Sellers from the Leawood Police Department contacted Oak Park PD, expressing his desire to understand exactly what investigative steps had been taken regarding Lisa's case. Learning that minimal effort had been invested in the investigation, Captain Sellers initiated his own inquiry into Lisa's disappearance. His decision proved providential, as just a few months later in April 1977, he discovered a teletype bulletin from Wisconsin that captured his attention. The Sauk County Sheriff's Office had distributed information about an unidentified body that had been found, describing the remains as belonging to a white female between 18 and 35 years old, measuring 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing approximately 105 pounds, with long dark hair and blue eyes. The bulletin mentioned a distinctive detail that immediately caught Captain Sellers' attention: a tattoo on the victim's upper left thigh. Lisa Staes had a tattoo in that exact location, making this potential match too significant to ignore. When Captain Sellers contacted the Sauk County Sheriff's Office, he learned that the woman's body had been discovered on January 24, 1976. Just 10 days after Lisa was reported missing. The body had been found beneath a bridge at a local creek, positioned in a fetal formation and frozen solid from exposure to Wisconsin's harsh winter conditions. The victim was completely nude except for a red and green tattoo and a small strand of gold-colored metal that appeared to be remnants of jewelry. Without fingerprints on file and no identifying materials at the scene, investigators had been unable to determine the woman's identity. Local law enforcement had assigned the victim a temporary designation that reflected both the circumstances of her discovery and the investigative practices of the era: Frigid Frida. This name stuck within the department and became how older employees referred to the case for decades to come. Detective Drew Bullen of the Sauk County Sheriff's Office later explained that such informal designations were common practice during that period for unidentified victims. In their efforts to identify Frigid Frida, Sauk County detectives had distributed hundreds of flyers containing her description to law enforcement agencies across the country. They also released composite sketches of the woman's face and her distinctive thigh tattoo to media outlets. These efforts generated potential matches from locations spanning New York to California, creating several thick folders of correspondence. However, all of these leads ultimately proved to be false identifications. The location where Frigid Frida was discovered provided few investigative clues. There was no evidence suggesting she had been murdered at the creek site, indicating that the location served merely as a dumping ground for her body. The subsequent autopsy failed to clarify the circumstances of her death significantly. The victim showed no defensive wounds, and her brain, which typically provides crucial information to medical examiners, had been damaged by prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures followed by thawing. Initially, the cause of death was classified as undetermined, though a later inquest ruled the case a homicide. The only potentially useful evidence recovered during the examination was foreign pubic hair found on the victim, suggesting recent sexual contact with another individual. The positioning of the body and the presence of this evidence led investigators to suspect a sexual component to the crime, prompting them to collect samples and perform procedures typical of sexual assault investigations. Hair analysis represented a popular forensic technique during the 1970s, involving microscopic examination of samples to compare characteristics such as color, size, and composition. The foreign pubic hair discovered on Frigid Frida was considered significant evidence, leading investigators to collect hair samples from various suspects for comparison purposes. However, none of these comparisons yielded matches to the evidence found on the victim. With no leads to pursue, Frigid Frida was buried in a local cemetery with only a small bronze plaque marking her grave as that of an unidentified female. This humble memorial would remain her only recognition until the day investigators could determine her true identity and provide proper acknowledgement of her life. That day arrived when Captain Sellers made contact with Sauk County regarding the potential match between Lisa Staes and their unidentified victim. To confirm the identification, authorities had to exhume Frigid Frida's body to obtain X-rays for dental comparison. When the analysis was completed, they had definitive confirmation. Frigid Frida was indeed Lisa Staes. The realization that Lisa's body had been discovered just 11 days after her disappearance proved devastating to her family. After 15 months of agonizing uncertainty, Lisa's mother, Susan, then in her 30s and now 91 years old, wrote a letter to the editor of the Baraboo News Republic, expressing the family's complex emotions upon learning the truth. In her letter, Susan described the helplessness the family had experienced while searching for answers about Lisa's whereabouts. She criticized the Illinois authorities for their inadequate response to Lisa's disappearance, expressing disappointment that their faith in law enforcement had been misplaced. However, she also conveyed deep gratitude for the compassionate treatment Lisa had received from Sauk County officials, who had arranged a proper funeral service at the Gaunt Funeral Home in Reedsburg. Susan wrote about watching the videotaped funeral service in the courthouse while openly weeping, finding some measure of peace in knowing that Lisa had been treated with dignity, even in death. She acknowledged that while their long nights of wondering were finally over, the investigation was only beginning in earnest for those tasked with finding Lisa's killer. With Lisa's identity confirmed, Sauk County investigators faced the challenge of determining when and where she had been murdered during the 11 days between her disappearance from Chicago and the discovery of her body nearly 200 miles away in Wisconsin. If Lisa had been killed in Sauk County, her murder would have represented the area's first homicide in almost 7 years, adding pressure to solve this unprecedented case. Investigators began where Oak Park police should have started 15 months earlier, by thoroughly researching Lisa's background and activities leading up to her disappearance. They started with Michelle, Lisa's cousin who had been hosting her during the Chicago visit. According to Michelle, Lisa had met and connected with a singer named David McKenzie the day before her disappearance, spending the night at his residence before returning safely to Michelle's home on Tuesday afternoon. Michelle suspected that Lisa had been experimenting with recreational drugs during her visit, possibly including marijuana, cocaine, and potentially heroin as part of the party scene she was exploring. However, these suspicions appeared to be based on the social context rather than direct observation of drug use. Michelle believed Lisa was seeking freedom and excitement during her Chicago adventure, embracing the nightlife and social opportunities the city offered. Lisa's parents, Susan and Jack, were unaware of any drug experimentation on their daughter's part, though they acknowledged it wouldn't have completely surprised them, given the era and Lisa's personality. They described Lisa as bold, curious, and fearless, someone who approached life with enthusiasm and wasn't easily intimidated by new experiences. She had been an excellent student in her early years, but had become distracted by typical teenage interests as she grew older. Investigators were unable to confirm whether Lisa had drugs in her system at the time of death, because toxicology screening apparently wasn't included in Frigid Frida's original autopsy report. However, they did interview David McKenzie, who provided detailed information about his interactions with Lisa. He described how they had met and connected, leading to Lisa spending the night at his Chicago apartment where they engaged in consensual sexual relations. David explained that he last saw Lisa the following morning or early afternoon when she boarded the L train to return to her cousins in Oak Park. He cooperated fully with investigators, providing hair samples and other evidence as requested. Laboratory analysis later excluded him as the source of the foreign hairs found on Lisa's body. Additionally, David had a verifiable alibi for the night Lisa disappeared. He was performing at another bar, which detectives confirmed with staff member. Investigators also interviewed Kurt, Lisa's other cousin, though by the time Sauk County became involved in the case, he had relocated away from the Chicago area. The case file contains limited information about Kurt, and it's unclear whether investigators ever considered him a suspect or what factors led to his apparent exclusion from suspicion. Another individual who should have received investigative attention was Mark Hansden, Lisa's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. According to Susan's initial statements to investigators, Lisa had planned the Chicago trip following a conflict with Mark, needing time away from their shared living situation to decompress from relationship tensions. However, Susan's current recollection differs from these early reports, remembering the trip as simply a routine family visit rather than an escape from relationship problems. Despite the potential significance of the boyfriend relationship, Detective Bullen notes that the case file shows Mark was never seriously considered as a suspect. The investigation appears to have identified him early, but conducted minimal follow-up work regarding his potential involvement. This lack of thorough investigation into obvious suspects represents a significant gap in the original investigation that continues to hamper current efforts. The case remained unsolved for the next 20 years, joining the growing ranks of cold cases that lacked the forensic technology needed for resolution. This changed around 1999 when investigators received correspondence from an incarcerated individual alleging that one of his fellow inmates might have information about Lisa's murder. The letter specifically mentioned William Zamasto, a convicted serial killer serving a life sentence in Wisconsin for multiple murders. William Zamasto had been convicted in the late 1970s for the 1978 murder of a woman who had been abducted from a Madison parking lot, sexually assaulted, and killed. His criminal history extended far beyond Wisconsin, however, as he was subsequently convicted of additional murders in California and Arizona. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of a double homicide involving hitchhikers in the Los Angeles area, and later for killing an FBI agent's daughter in Tucson, Arizona, where he had sexually assaulted the victim before dumping her body in Theo Desert. Unlike some of his more famous contemporaries, such as John Wayne Gacy, Ed Kemper, or David Berkowitz, William Zamasto never achieved widespread notoriety, possibly because his crime spanned multiple states rather than terrorizing a specific wide geographic area. When the fellow inmate wrote to investigators about Zamasto, he specifically mentioned a victim found underneath a bridge in Sauk County, details that could have been gleaned from news reports but were specific enough to warrant investigation. Investigators began researching Zamasto's whereabouts during January 1976 and discovered that he was indeed in custody in Dane County, approximately 1 hour from Sauk County. However, he was serving time for a lesser crime and had been granted work release privileges, meaning he definitely had been in the general area when Lisa was murdered. The jail records from that period were stored on microfilm and proved difficult to read, making it impossible to definitively confirm whether Zamasto was incarcerated or on work release during the specific time frame of Lisa's disappearance. When investigators attempted to interview Zamasto around 1999, he presented them with a list of demands and refused to provide any information about Lisa unless these conditions were met. His demands included serving his sentence in a specific prison and receiving certain guarantees from authorities. Investigators suspected that Zamasto might be claiming responsibility for murders he didn't commit in order to gain advantages for himself, given his life sentence and limited options for improving his circumstances. The standoff between investigators and Zamasto resulted in no useful information being obtained. Detectives were unwilling to negotiate with his demands without first receiving specific details about Lisa's murder that only the killer would know. Zamasto refused to provide such information without his conditions being met, creating an impasse that effectively ended this line of investigation. He was never definitively ruled in or out as a suspect in Lisa's murder. Nearly another full decade passed without significant movement in the case. During this period, Lisa's brother Grant acknowledged that the family had largely given up hope of ever achieving closure regarding Lisa's murder. While they continued to hope that the killer would somehow face justice, either through legal means or other circumstances, they had stopped expecting any breakthrough in the investigation. In the late 2000s, the inmate who had originally written to investigators about William Zamasto was released from prison and subsequently died, eliminating that potential source of information. Despite Zamasto being a convicted offender with DNA on file, investigators never pursued genetic comparison options, partly because DNA testing wasn't yet on their radar, and partly because they would have needed a search warrant to obtain his hair. Samples for comparison to evidence found on Lisa, as forensic science evolved far beyond the hair analysis techniques of the 1970s. Sauk County investigators began taking advantage of new technologies to re-examine physical evidence from Lisa's case. Their first attempt at DNA testing occurred in 25 years after Lisa's murder. Laboratory analysis identified sperm cells on the collected swabs, but insufficient genetic material was present to develop a complete profile suitable for database comparison. The laboratory was only able to collect 6 sperm heads from a prepared smear, while complete profiles typically require between 20 and 50 specimens at minimum. In 2009, investigators submitted the foreign pubic hairs and rectal swabs for additional testing. While trace levels of male DNA were detected on some of the hairs, the quantity remained insufficient for profile development. Analysis of the rectal swabs detected no male DNA, preventing further examination. The case remained dormant until Detective Drew Bullen was assigned to it in fall 2022, following an unusual development. Someone had contacted the sheriff's office to report that they had observed fresh flowers being placed on Lisa's grave in the local cemetery. This discovery sparked renewed interest from supervisory staff, who wondered if Lisa's killer might still be alive and living in Sauk County, possibly feeling remorse after all these years. Detective Bullen spoke with the cemetery caretaker, who had assumed family members were leaving the flowers. However, Grant confirmed that while his parents had once made annual visits to Lisa's grave, they hadn't returned since his mother suffered a stroke 7 years earlier. The cemetery lacked surveillance video, and the caretaker had never witnessed anyone placing the flowers, leaving the identity of this mysterious visitor unknown. While Detective Bullen never determined who was leaving the flowers, the situation prompted him to re-examine Lisa's case with fresh eyes. His assessment was that if the case was ever going to be solved, advances in DNA testing would likely provide the key. He consulted with laboratory analysts who confirmed that significant improvements in DNA science between 2009 and 2023 warranted resubmitting evidence for analysis. Unfortunately, the resubmitted swabs produced disappointing results, with analysts reporting that the samples were too degraded for useful analysis. Detective Bullen submitted additional material in 2023, essentially everything remaining from the original evidence collection, but continues to await those results. His hope is that a complete male DNA profile can be developed, which would allow investigators to utilize genetic genealogy techniques that have proven successful in numerous cold cases. If DNA testing fails to provide answers, Detective Bullen is pursuing traditional investigative approaches as well. He is currently attempting to locate Mark Hansden, Lisa's former boyfriend, though this effort has been complicated by the lack of detailed identifying information in the original reports. It's not even clear whether Mark is still alive, highlighting the challenges investigators face when revisiting decades-old cases with incomplete documentation. Detective Bullen is also working to determine if David Mackenzie is still alive, though given his cooperation during the 1970s investigation and his exclusion as a source of physical evidence, he ranks lower on the priority list. The possibility remains that someone with knowledge of Lisa's murder is still alive and might be willing to come forward with information, particularly as family loyalties and fears change over time. In 2023, the case received renewed attention when a convicted murderer serving a life sentence in Wisconsin published an article on PrisonWriters.com titled, "My Friend, a Serial Killer is Ready to Confess." The author, Justin Welch, claimed to be close friends with William Zamasto, whom he referred to as Wild Bill, and stated that he knew about many murders Zamasto had committed but never been convicted of. Welch wrote that Zamasto had killed so many people over the years that he couldn't remember half of them, and that nobody had any idea of the true extent of his crimes because so much time had passed. However, this potential breakthrough came with familiar conditions. Welch indicated that he and Zamasto would only provide information about additional murders if the federal government guaranteed their transfer to the federal prison system for the remainder of their sentences. This recent development mirrors the same negotiation dynamic that stalled the investigation in 1999, with convicted killers attempting to leverage information about unsolved murders to improve their incarceration conditions. Whether this represents genuine knowledge of Lisa's murder or simply another attempt at manipulation remains unclear, but it demonstrates that the case continues to generate interest and potential leads even after nearly 5 decades. The murder of Lisa Staes remains an open investigation with the Sauk County Sheriff's Office, representing one of Wisconsin's longest-running unsolved homicides. Detective Bullen continues to pursue both technological and traditional investigative approaches, hoping that advances in DNA science or new witness testimony might finally provide the breakthrough needed to identify Lisa's killer. The case serves as a stark reminder of how investigative failures in the crucial early hours and days following a crime can have lasting consequences, while also demonstrating the persistent dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to let cold cases remain forever unsolved. Nearly 50 years after Lisa's frozen body was discovered beneath that Wisconsin bridge, her family still seeks justice and closure. The young woman who once embraced life with bold curiosity and fearless enthusiasm deserves to have her story properly concluded, her killer identified and held accountable for the violence that cut short a promising life, just as it was beginning to unfold.